Colloquium. It's my great honor to introduce Professor James Loeffler. But I first want to thank Natan Paradise, our Associate Director, and Mario for all your work in helping with the lecture series. I also want to thank our co-sponsors, which include the Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies, Department of History, and the Institute for Global Studies, and also to thank the gift and memory of Julia Kay and Harold Signal, also who make our lecture series and our visitors who come here possible. And also I wanted to mention that Professor Loeffler will be speaking tonight at Beth Jacob Congregation at 7:30 p.m. on the subject of double amnesia, Zionism, and human rights in 1948 and today. So hope you can all join us this evening as well. Professor Loeffler is the Berkowitz Professor of Jewish History at the University of Virginia. He is the author of many studies, articles, chapters, many articles, also newspapers, magazines as well. He is the author of The Most Musical Nation, Jews and Culture in the Late Russian Empire, a book which has received many awards. And I think among the various things that Jim does, he's also a pianist and a musicologist. But much of his work in recent years has focused on the relationship with Jews and human rights. And he recently published an edited volume, The Law of Strangers, Jewish Lawyers and International Law in the 20th Century, and a wonderful book, Rooted Cosmopolitans, Jews, and Human Rights in the 20th Century. It was just published by Yale University Press in 2018. And he's currently writing another book, Blind Justice, the Jewish Legal Battle Against Antisemitism in Modern America. And so I think this is related to the theme of today's colloquium. So I hand it over to Jim.
Thank you. After the introduction, I feel like I should turn around and play the piano for you, but I won't. Different talk. So I want to thank the Center for putting this together and for the opportunity to come present some work in progress, which is a real privilege and just fun to be able to think out loud and share some research with you, and also hear some of your own questions about this. So it's a treat to be here, and I'm glad to be able to speak. I want to introduce you to this subject right away with a story, and it's the story of a riot. On Thursday, February 7, 1946, Chicago hosted two of America's greatest white supremacists, Gerald L.K. Smith, head of the America First Party, and Father Arthur Terminiello, the Father Coughlin of the South, who's sometimes known as a renegade Catholic priest, who came together as part of a tour to spread white supremacy and their politics across the country, and arrived in Chicago in that February. So they went to speak in a civic hall that rented for the occasion, and 600 people came out to hear them. And meanwhile, 3,000 people came out to protest them. The people outside were an interesting mix of local Christian clergy, Jewish World War II vets, some of them still in their uniforms, African-American civil rights activists, labor activists, and many others. And in his speech inside the hall, Father Terminiello took advantage of this to talk about the threat that his people faced from the people outside. He said, quote, "The atheistic, Zionistic Jews picketing outside threaten our lives and our liberty." He lamented that returning Christian veterans were going to lose their jobs to Jewish vets and to blacks. And And then he hit on his peak applause line, which was the following: "Our democracy is not a democracy, but a mobocracy ruled by communistic Jews. All communistic Jews should be sent back to Russia." And members of the audience responded by shouting, supporting this, and at least one person shouted, "Kill the Jews." Outside the hall, while he's giving this lecture, things turned violent. The protesters began to hurl bottles and stink bombs through the air towards the building. The police began to react by beating the protesters. And all the while that this was happening, there was a man named Judge Samuel Heller who was wandering through the crowd looking for his daughter. So Heller was a local judge, a Jewish man and a local judge, who'd come out to hear the hate speech with his own ears. And he left in the middle of the rally and walked outside and found himself inside the riot. And he was looking for his teenage daughter named Sonia. What he sees and hears is the police beating people and then arresting the protesters and hauling them off. So he rushes over to a local precinct where he finds 19 young people, the protesters, being held without charge. One teenager is bleeding profusely from his head, and another one is unconscious. Infuriated, Judge Heller summons his clerk and his bailiff and another judge, and he holds court in the police station. And he orders the protesters freed, and then he issued arrest warrants for Smith and Terminiello. He charged them on grounds of incitement to riot with racist and anti-Semitic speech. They were charged, and they were tried, and they were convicted. This was despite the fact that they requested and were granted an all-white, all-Christian jury and a non-Jewish judge. They declared they could only have a fair trial if they got this, and they got this. Nevertheless, they were convicted, and they appealed, and that case eventually reached the Supreme Court in 1949. Oops, got ahead of myself. Terminiello v. Chicago became a very important case in the history of constitutional law and the debates about free speech and hate speech. It also produced a very close verdict, a 5-4 verdict. And in this verdict, the Supreme Court ruled in favor of Terminiello on what I would say are procedural grounds. Now, as I lay out the story for you, I'm happy to, when I'm done in conversation to go into some of the legal details and technicalities of it, which are important. But for our purposes right now, let me just put it this way to you. He won his appeal to the Supreme Court basically on the question of instructions to the jury, not on the law itself, but was the jury properly instructed when they considered his appeal, his case in the first place. In his dissent, Justice Jackson issued a very famous statement. Justice Robert H. Jackson, just back from the Nuremberg trials, denounced what he called the danger in the situation that kind of fetishization of doctrinaire logic about the Constitution would lead to allowing hate to flourish. And he famously said the line that the Constitution became quoted as, "The Constitution is not a suicide pact." Or as he's put it here, "This will convert the Constitutional Bill of Rights into a suicide pact." Okay? So, what's interesting about this story is that you won't find it in many history books. You'll find it in con law books, and law professors among us will talk about it and sort of dismiss it because it's not as interesting or as important as some other post-war free speech First Amendment cases. And you won't find it in American Jewish history books either, even though we have wonderful American Jewish history written by scholars who examine this area and the question of civil rights and Jewish activism and anti-Semitism in great detail. And I think the reason for it is because the story we typically tell is a story about the post-war triumph of what you could call civil libertarianism. And I would summarize the story this way. Against censorship and segregation, McCarthyism and school prayer, American Jews chose civil liberties as their strategy for legal equality in post-war America. They fought for full and equal citizenship for themselves and others as individuals inside liberalism's vaunted neutral sphere. They also chose the courts as the place where ultimately justice would be and should be blind, and equality open to all as individuals. They resisted defining themselves in American law as what we would call a legible minority, a minority that has a legal status as a minority, even as they pushed for civil rights protections for African Americans. That libertarian orthodoxy famously extended even to the defense of neo-Nazis in Skokie, in this 1977 Skokie trial and affair. Now, after Charlottesville, where I come from, and Squirrel Hill and Jersey City, and the executive order, we are witnessing a debate among American Jews and others about whether this is the right legal strategy for American Jews to think about when it comes to anti-Semitism. But we have very little sense of how we got here. And so the goal of the book from which this research comes is to think about American Jews, anti-Semitism, and civil rights across the 20th century, mostly focused after World War II. And I'm trying to tell the story in terms of 5 trials. One of them is this trial that I've spoken to you about for a few minutes today. My argument is that we need to recover this forgotten history, as well as the forgotten forms of what I could call American liberalism, and American Jewish liberalism, that were left behind in this shift after World War II to this post-war civil libertarianism. So what I'm going to do now is turn back to 1946 and tell you a little bit more about this story of the riot and the legal aspects of it. And I'm just going to briefly sketch it out in some detail and talk about what happened at that point in time. And then I'm going to stop and invite your questions as discuss more about how this fits into the book project that I'm engaged in, as well as the larger issues. So let's turn back to 1946. If we look more closely at the events of that riot, we can see what I would call 2 different strains of American Jewish liberalism inside American society and competing for primacy. Because it turns out that Judge Heller did not spontaneously decide to attend the rally. You'll recall I said he's there to hear for himself his hate mongers, and then he starts looking for his daughter. It turns out he did not spontaneously decide to open court in the police station or to charge Terminiello and Smith with riot incitement. The rally outside, or the protest outside, was not a quick mobilization where people spread the word, these bigots are coming to town. It was all planned, and it was all planned beginning a year in advance. During World War II, Chicago became a hotbed for white supremacists, and it's triggered a huge internal debate in the Chicago world of Jewish politics and civil rights more largely about how to respond. As local leaders debated what to do, they basically split into 2 camps. One camp I would call the legal libertarians. And this consisted of a loose coalition of some interesting groups that you might or might not expect to be in this camp, who all got together and said, the challenge we face is racism and anti-Semitism, but the way to fight it is through defending civil liberties, as well as through civil disobedience. Those things can and should go hand in hand, but not through seeking new laws to stop the hate, and not through seeking political public rallies against it that will force the law in new directions. So this group comprised the ACLU, American Civil Liberties Union, perhaps not surprising because of their standing commitment to free speech, right, and civil liberties. It also included the American Jewish Committee, right, one of the main Jewish communal organizations still around, that was comprised of lots of different people, in fact, but basically led by more elite American Jewish liberals who were more skittish about public Jewishness, even though they did some very important things to stand for Jewish rights, and more interested in what has often been described as a more quiet approach to civil rights as well as international human rights issues. It included the local branch of the American B'nai B'rith, Anti-Defamation League, which had a strong center in Chicago and in the Midwest, and was concerned about these issues, but again did not want to do kind of legal activism. And then it included an interesting group called Chicago Council Against Racial and Religious Discrimination. This was a very important group led by a man named Homer Jack. And I'll just mention him because Homer Jack was someone who was born Jewish and converted to Unitarian Christianity, and went on to become very active in the fight against segregation in housing in Chicago. So he's very progressive in his politics, right? And he was involved later on in CORE. So he was involved in sort of white liberal solidarity with civil rights activism of African Americans and pushing for progressive measures against racism. But all of these people were not interested in challenging those hate mongers and challenging hate speech. They said this is not the way to go, and they vociferously opposed efforts to do anything with the law about it. The law should be about formal equality, making everyone equal. It shouldn't be about pushing it in new directions to shut down this group. On the other side was a different group of American Jewish leaders and some others with them, some other local civil rights leaders. And these people would have said, and did say, that you shouldn't have to accept hate speech just to have free speech. I call them legal communitarians. It's kind of not a perfect word for it, but let me tell you who they are and you'll see why I use this phrase. This is a coalition led by the American Jewish Congress, and I apologize because this is one of these stories when you get with Jews, you get with tons of acronyms and tons of different organizations, right? They had to have two groups that are both AJC. It was a punishment on historians. But the American Jewish Congress were also liberals, also progressive on civil rights issues, but they were much more interested in Jewish public identity. They were Zionist. They were interested in Jewish nationhood, supporting a campaign for self-determination in Palestine. And they were much more assertive in things such as promoting a boycott of Nazi Germany, and pushing also for more laws to fight for Jewish rights in this country explicitly. They partnered with Jewish trade unions in Chicago. They partnered with youth groups, liberal Christian clergy, as well as an important element in this story, Jewish veterans, military veterans, an organization of their own, and a group called Chicago Civil Liberties Council, which was basically a more radical version of the ACLU. A group that said the ACLU is too much, is too moderate, it's too much committed to civil liberties, it's not committed enough to fighting racism. So in the 40s, this group, and it eventually formed a coalition, Defense Against Antisemitism, Inc., was part of an effort to do new things with American law, pushing forward new anti-defamation laws, new laws on the books that would punish hate speech, that would shut it down and shut down other forms of racist mobilization. They developed model bills for different state legislatures across the country to do this, and to combat what we might call expressive discrimination, to go alongside with the other forms of anti-discrimination law, equal fair housing, equal employment, so on and so forth. This group believed in what is often called group libel, which is the idea that you could have laws to protect groups from defamation, just like you have laws to protect individuals from libel or defamation. And this meant giving groups a legal status, and some of these were actually criminal statutes, akin to actually, and this is the most interesting thing about this, akin to labor unions, and saying if workers can get together and form a status of a collective group to have legal rights and to fight for them, even though the workers are not just workers, and they might leave that union one day, it's not an essential identity, minorities ought to be able to do that too, and that we should be able to push the law in this direction. One of the people behind it is an interesting man, a Russian/Italian Jewish immigrant, one of the first people to write about fascism in Italy until he was kicked out of Italy, Alexander Pekulis, who came here and began to develop these ideas during World War II. This is a little brief up here. He filed with the FCC trying to argue they should deny a license to a newspaper in New York to open a radio station because of the pro-Nazi and anti-Semitic racist things they had broadcast. And he gives us this quote, which for the sake of time I'm not going to read the quote, but I'll just leave it up there. And draw your attention, as I said, to the fact that he's suggesting that we can learn from what labor has done with law in this country to imagine what civil rights could do with law in this country. Now, in the face of the impending arrival of these white supremacists to Chicago, the American Jewish Congress's new Committee to Combat Antisemitism decided that they would use a law on the books, to push forward a case against them once they arrived in town. That law was, again, I'm going to simplify here for the sake of time, That law was based on a 1917 state law in Illinois that had been enacted in response to the Springfield race riots, right, and to an earlier episode. And their goal was to, quote, respond to these bigots and to push back against their, quote, so-called right to inflame against a racial or religious group. This strategy was devised by this judge I mentioned to you, Judge Heller, and a man named Ira Latimer, who was a Christian civil rights activist and a radical anti-racist activist, you might describe it. And the idea was Judge Heller would happen to be at the rally, and he would run into Ira Latimer, and Ira Latimer would say, I, Judge, want to swear out a complaint against these bigots. And the judge would say, that's good for you, because I'm a judge. And then they would do it, and that's exactly what they did. Over the course of the year before the rally, amazingly enough, this was openly debated in Chicago, and the other group, the civil libertarians, opposed it, and they would have meetings where they would discuss whether or not this is the right tactic or not to use. Community-wide meetings, enough so that I could trace this through the press, right? It wasn't a secret clandestine thing, it was discussed. After the trial, the first trial, where the two bigots were convicted, there was a continual debate about this, and the debate continued to be framed in terms of, is this the right thing or not? The communitarians involved said, now we've shown you, this isn't heresy, we're not destroying American civil liberties, we're doing something that we can do, and this is necessary for also our fellow Jews wake up and realize this is a tool we can use. So one of the editorials is directed at B'nai B'rith, saying your disastrous shah policy must end, right? Quietism isn't going to help us. And calling for expanding these laws and doing more with them. The Chicago Jewish Sentinel editorialized that the legal success of the trial in Chicago has, quote, crushed the false camouflage of the freedom of speech, ending the possibilities for hate mongers to spread venom without legal retaliation. And over the next several years, these efforts led to this type of state laws and even a federal law project, as I mentioned. Now, I told you that this went all the way to the Supreme Court, where on a 5-4 verdict, it was overturned, that case, right? So you might say, well, then it didn't go anywhere. But in truth, and in the book, when I proceed a little more slowly, I talk about how that basically bled into another case, which went back before the Supreme Court, also coming from Illinois, with white supremacists. A famous case, O'Harney v. Illinois, which went up, and the verdict went the other way. There, on 5-4 grounds, the same issues were taken up by the Supreme Court. And again, for those listening or watching, there are legal technicalities about these cases. They were not exactly the same about what was being adjudicated. But the larger principles were there, and this was clearly part of a political moment of legal imagination about what was possible. It's a very interesting story about how that case went up to the Supreme Court, because essentially there was Jewish and African American political pressure in Chicago to do something, because the white supremacists were still there, and there was rioting and violence involving attempts to integrate housing, and there was pamphleteering happening. So this case went up as another important case, and it was won. It was won, and famously, in this case, Judge Felix Frankfurter said, similarly to that quote I showed you from Alexander Pekulis, he said in the case that, in fact, this is a useful tool, analogous to what labor unions are able to do. We're not saying you must be stuck in a Jewish category or a black category and your identity is hardened into it, but we're saying if you can face this threat, law can be shaped in a way in which it can protect you without violating the First Amendment. It was a very close decision, as I mentioned, 5-4. And it's interesting because, contrary to the way it's often reported, Justice Jackson, who changed his mind here and voted against it, he opposed it in his dissent, not on grounds that it was wrong, but on grounds that it was impractical. And he also said the shoe might be a free speech might be useful, but mostly he said it was impractical to do this. Okay, so what happened? The answer is nothing. This is sort of the legal revolution that didn't happen. over the next decade, the legal communitarian strategy of these people, which had given them this tool in theory, disappeared. And the 50s became this strange moment of kind of a halfway house in between these two camps, thinking about what do Jews want from the law and what can the law do. And over time, the civil libertarians won out. And they won out basically because the coalitions disappeared and everyone in this story I'm telling you essentially shifted over to this model of First Amendment is the best and most important thing to do, and we do not want to ask for group protections or these new types of legal tools. As the American Jewish Congress put it at the time, the libertarian aspect of our philosophy became dominant. And what happened really is there was a rising faith in the power and necessity of free speech, of equal protection, and of due process as the best ways to guarantee civil rights for everyone. These become the quintessence of the Jewish civil rights strategy. And beginning with Brown v. Board of Education, American Jews get very involved in advocacy, but it's advocacy for what we could call legal liberalism, a race-blind, faith-blind, group-blind kind of individual civil liberties as the way forward for justice. In this process, a lot of the stuff that we're talking about here, hate speech, becomes constructed as an exception to free speech, as something off that maybe we have to kind of, in certain extreme cases, incitement or things like that, we might be willing to say this, and they're framed as kind of opposites, right? And this sets the bounds of much of liberalism as we have it today. So where does that leave us? As I said in writing this book, because I think we're in the midst of a set of debates about this, where some of these assumptions and the consensus that's solidified at the moment has begun to crack. Right? And we also are in a strange place with law, as we see about the impeachment and about debates about judges and rule of law and what can be done. Right? We revere law as Americans, but we also question it. There's a suspicion about whether law is strong enough to do the work it needs to do. And we want law to stand above politics, but everyone knows that politics makes law, right? That's how we build law. We vote for it, legislatures pass it, judges have politics, and so on and so forth. And this is even more true when we deal with the thorny question of anti-Semitism. We want politics and law totally separate, even though we all recognize they can't be fully separable. So in that sense, I think we've returned to this moment, right? We're asking questions about what liberalism is and what it can mean, it should mean. We're asking questions about sort of what should be the best strategy. Is the solution to, in a certain sense, majoritarianize civil rights, to make American law totally blind to groups, and make everybody, just ensure everyone gets the due process there? Or is the proper task to minoritize it and to think about different ways in which law has to treat different types of identity different? Gender is one, migration is another, sexuality, and maybe race and religion are also that. These are open questions. And in a certain sense, I just want to leave you with one other formulation of them, which is our goal to make justice truly blind, or to make the law see the difference and deliver justice through that difference in new and necessary ways? Thank you. So, as I understand, I'm very happy just to hear your reactions and your questions about this project and process. Yeah.
Just a small factual question. In the second Supreme Court case regarding the pamphlets, what position did Justice Douglas take, if you remember, given what he'd done in the first case?
Right. I believe that Justice Douglas is also in the dissent. Don't quote me on that, but I'm pretty sure he also is in the dissent. That's pretty good. Yeah.
I was wondering, do you know of any dialogue between the Jewish communities in, let's say, France or later Germany and the U.S. Communities about whether what you call legal communitarians, or which approach is better? Because as you know, in France and Germany, you go to jail when you deny the Holocaust,
right.
And the First Amendment is interpreted, or their First Amendment
right.
is more towards we can legislate, and we are legislating against certain kinds of hate speech. So what when you have a dialogue between Jewish communities in France or Germany and here, how do they reconcile that? Is there
That's a wonderful question. Yeah, so there is a dialogue, and it takes two different forms, and it does reflect, you know, I said that this story ends, but it doesn't completely end. These two different, these folks and these folks, you can still trace them through the 50s and 60s, even into the 70s. So some of these people, associated with an organization called the World Jewish Congress, who I treat at some length in the book that you heard mentioned, they comprise people in Europe, and they keep saying, this is crazy, right? I mean, in Europe, to be a liberal and to defend civil liberties doesn't mean you have to, you know, create this First Amendment orthodoxy that Americans seem so obsessed with. So they do point to it, and they point to it frequently and say, this is a great example. Over there, this is what's possible. In fact, most of the world has this. So they do say that. Now, the more interesting case is what happens with the legacy of these folks. Because what begins to happen in the 50s and 60s, and again I talk about this in the book, is that some of these American Jewish civil libertarians begin to say, we should have an international law criminalizing Holocaust denial or anti-Semitism, but not in America. So they begin to kind of create this split, right, which is sort of an American exceptionalism model, where they say, okay, over there, you know, out there or over there, Jews do need legal protection, and we're willing to ask for it. But we would never want that in here because the American model gives us all we need, right? And they get stuck on the contradictions of that. The person I'm thinking of is a man named Morris Abram, who's an important figure, and an important figure in international legal history these days because of his role in creating what became the International Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. So, but he's a very complicated person because he opposes affirmative action here, and he's an early American Jewish liberal voice opposed to it, and he defends, you know, the constitutional model here, right, very, very vigorously, and many of his political opponents at the UN kind of skewer him on it. They say you're inconsistent about what you want for Jews and for others, right? So that's a tension in it, and that you see reflected. So they're definitely paying attention to it. I think it tells us.
So just to add to that, so the question, so this is a very interesting question in terms of the dialogue, and so I'm just wondering, you allude to it a bit, but what can you say more about what the dynamics were after World War II, and this whole idea of as Holocaust survivors are coming to America, and the idea of becoming a part of the American project.
Yeah.
What happened in the 1950s and into the 60s, and how that dynamic changed in terms of this discussion between libertarians versus communitarians.
Right. That's a wonderful question. You know, generally speaking, there's a debate among scholars about how much Holocaust consciousness is present for American Jewish political culture there, and the ways in which it's sort of sidelined in this moment. Let's say these decade and a half between this and the civil rights mid-60s. But generally, surprisingly, it's often framed, even by some of the survivor leaders, meaning Jewish Holocaust survivors who get involved in some of these organizations. I'm thinking of Joachim Prinz, who was a rabbi, a leader in the civil rights movement, and it was a German rabbi who spoke in the March on Washington. But generally, it's framed as a lesson in liberalism, that what we experienced over there was the terrible of race prejudice, and what we experienced over there is the destruction of freedoms of a society, and therefore what we need over here is to make sure we get rid of this race prejudice and build up a liberal civil rights model. So it doesn't bring a lot of that communitarian thing. What I do think happens is a lot of, in my take on it, many of those young people, even if they come from Europe, they also tend to kind of exceptionalize America, and they also tend to outsource a lot of the minority or communitarian identity aspirations onto Israel. And that's why they can think of Zionism not as a refugee project or not as something that Jews are religiously attached to, but they'll say, actually, that's about a fulfillment of a communitarian aspiration over there. That's my work with others. So they will support it, and they'll say that's why it's also fully compatible with over here, imagining people just as democratic individuals, right? Without a hierarchy, without different communities. And they'll go over there and say, well, isn't it nice that Israel is a democracy and you have different communities? That's okay that they're different, Jews and Arabs, right? Their status and all this. They're okay with that because that's over there. and over here is something else inside America. So I think the Holocaust doesn't necessarily cut the way we might imagine it would into shaping their identities.
I just wonder how so then it begs the question in terms of how American documents, like the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and how people read those as part of the American exceptionalism, and sort of buying into that. Of course, today we are, again, going back and looking at those documents and questioning some of them in terms of how indeed equal in terms of ensuring the equality across all Americans. But I just wonder too, in terms of how those documents, and how people read those documents in terms of what you're saying, in terms of feeding into this idea.
And the answer, again, the answer is, I mean, the most, I would say, I'm not going to judge this because they're most self-aware. These folks, they do grapple with that. And I think the most interesting people that I find are the ones who come from Europe, and they say what was possible and what we call democracy in Europe in the interwar period meant something very different than here, and why can't we have that here? Most of them ultimately make their peace with it and say, you know what, this is the price we pay for acceptance here. And I think it gets into a sense of, even if we lose something in the process, we have to become American. You know, there's one line I think about from one person I wrote about in this book who says, you know, American liberalism succeeded by killing the separatism of its minorities. And it's a man who spent 2 decades insisting in Europe, the League of Nations and those international institutions, that minority, you know, to be a minority was not a curse, it was okay, and that the law should be able to recognize that, and that wasn't undemocratic or illiberal, that was a better version of liberalism. And he came over here and he basically said, well, you know what, sort of with a bitter sense of resignation, that's what America's about, and maybe, here's the other thing, maybe that's the only way to deal with America's racial problem. Because maybe, you know, and there was a complicated relationship, these people are not the only people in the room, and some of them say, well, yeah, it's hard not to argue that we should get rid of segregation, and so it points us in this way. I'll give you one other example, if you guys will indulge me. This case, I always find this case fascinating. This case, the ACLU defends this man, Bo Harnett. And there's this incredible correspondence where he says, I know you don't like me because you're all Jewish lawyers, but you're bound to defend me because you believe in free speech. And they write back and they say, well, we're not all Jewish lawyers, but we are a lot of Jewish lawyers. But yes, we will defend you, don't worry. And then the strange twist in this is this case, after the verdict, it is appealed, because you can appeal a Supreme Court case and ask them to rehear it. And the person who takes that forward is Thurgood Marshall Jr. Thurgood Marshall Jr. at this time is a lawyer at the NAACP, about to argue Brown v. Board. He takes a leave of absence from the NAACP to argue on behalf of the white supremacists. And the NAACP is furious with him because they say, how can you be representing this guy? And, you know, and it's the same debate, right? And he says, you know what, this is a victory for civil liberties, that's what we need, formal equality, right? So I think, and some of the Jews are in the same position, they see like all these complicated ideas about liberalism, but they basically say, look, this is the way the sails are pointed, we need this, and they need this. And P.S., maybe this makes it easier for Jews to move into the majority population, and, you know, there's a, I don't want to say too many ideas at once, but let me just say, there's a charitable reading of this, which is that American Jews say, this is good for everyone, right? And Thurgood Marshall Jr., he understands it too. We want to be equal. Everyone should be equal. So all this stuff isn't going to help with making law just treat everyone equally. There's a more cynical version, which is American Jews say, well, we want to be treated as white people, right? And therefore, this actually helps us with that. We don't want to be coded as minority. And we see what happens to racial minorities in this country. So we want to help them and help ourselves. But that's all being kind of thought out. And I think in between 1952, when Thurgood Marshall Jr. does this, and 1954, you can see almost the beginning of this shift in what people think is desirable and possible. Although, as I emphasize, it will take a whole decade before many of the things I've described will really come to fruition. Yeah.
So stuff on trees.
The anti-lynching.
Yes, but it doesn't ban hate propaganda.
No, it
that
doesn't,
leads
right,
to it.
right. So, right, we're at an interesting moment where that law, which has been, on a project like the ERA, right, for a long time, it's in some sense an act of historical justice to put a law on the books that people believe and hope won't be necessary, but to kind of make up for the fact that the law never was done before. So it's more symbolic in a lot of ways. And that's frankly also why it got passed, because it's easier to do that than some of the harder questions about hate speech, incitement.
So thank you for just an incredibly fascinating presentation. Very, very interesting. So, have affirmative action not come, this would be a very different conversation.
Yeah.
And if you want, maybe you can, of course, comment on that because, with the exception of the National Council of Jewish Women, I mean, the organized Jewish opposition was so overwhelming. But as part of that, what interests me is what happens to Jews, aside from all the acronyms and everything else. And your point about Zionism is so fascinating. But the other thing that's clearly happening over this period of time has to do with class mobility, falling of certain kinds of quotas. The 1960s as this huge shift in class and various other things. So if you were to put it in a broader historical context beyond these kinds of debates, does that have some impact, or is that too sort of materialist or naive of a reading of this to see the really dramatic ways that American Jews and within American Jewish life is changing over and beyond the critical insight of Zionism?
Thank you. Absolutely. You didn't mention the one thing I thought you were going to mention, which was anti-communism. As we had a chance to talk about it.
But
before.
anti-communism, yeah.
But with that, I would just say that there was
Could
clearly.
you first comment on anti-communism?
Yeah,
which
yeah,
is
no, I mean,
interesting to me right now, in addition to
Right.
real shifts in American Jewish life.
Right. I mean, and it's very clear for some of these people that, this isn't only a story of the First Amendment, but it's central to this conversation. And many of these people say, with McCarthyism happening in the 1950s, the First Amendment is the best way we need it, vitally. So we don't want to tinker with it, right? We want to use it to protect people from the hysteria of McCarthyist anti-communism. And this is important also for people in the story. As you can understand, many of these people are pretty progressive, pretty far left, or very far left in their politics. So even if it's not about communism, they still think that the First Amendment it serves their purposes and it needs to be protected. So things converge at that point. The other issues that you're mentioning, I think I agree with you, are very important. One way to tell the story is to say, people keep mentioning labor, right? They keep thinking with labor, talking about labor rights. But because of American Jewish socioeconomic mobility, maybe the attachment to the labor movement just isn't there in the same way as it had been, even though culturally American Jews continue to be, fond of it, identified with it. Irving Howe, World of Our Fathers, all that. But that's different than people who said, wait a second, if we can get into universities now in larger numbers and into liberal professions or small business, and we can get into these different parts of the economy, so labor doesn't have the same attachment or influence in some of the concerns, and individualism does, right? So I think there's an economic dimension to it also, and I think that also explains a lot of the kind of semi-forgotten opposition among American Jews to affirmative action, where people say, just as people argue about today, well, it's going to take away my interests or my children's interests, my kids' spot, right? There's a lot of that fear, and I do think that really drives it, even as people say, no, I'm just liberal in every respect, and I think the affirmative action, discriminates against people, foments division, right? there are arguments about that, but I do think the economic dimension is very vital here. And it's not a coincidence. I think the best way to push back on my narrative would be to say, well, okay, this is a moment when the Supreme Court is about to change. A new court's coming in. Frankfurter is gone. The court that was a kind of Rooseveltian court, the way thought about the second Bill of Rights, as it's sometimes called, social and economic concerns, is going away. And we're going to shift to a different kind of court, which will fit a different type of society and vision of that. So that all, Jews are, as historians like say, Jews are, they're like everyone else, only more so, right? They reflect the same trends as they experience them with different points of influence. Yeah.
So, one gets the sense strongly of tendencies toward assimilation that undergirds a lot of this. Where did various religious leaders land on this issue?
Yeah. That's a wonderful question.
I mean all religious leaders, not just Jewish.
Well, all religious leaders. They're all over the map. I mean, one of the things I find interesting about looking at who fits into which box at this time is it's a little unpredictable. It's not based on these are the wealthy and these are the working class. It's not based on, what it's also not based on is something that we often recognize today when we talk about Jewish American politics, which is right and left, right? Because conservatism, there are Jewish conservatives, but they're a very small demographic, and it doesn't play out on those lines the way some of these issues now do. And religiously, you have clergy in both camps. You have Reform movement Jewish leaders, which is the more progressive liberal wing of in religious terms, religious observance terms, who are strongly in favor of this, and also you can see clearly a discomfort with Jewishness and a desire to be more acculturated into America, and then you see others from the same denomination who are very strongly identified with the fight for group rights, group identity. So there's no one pattern that is here. I think that's probably, I don't know what Professor Pearl would say, I think that's probably generally characteristic of this moment, and we see this also in the American Jewish South, where there's kind of these different reactions to civil rights, and some American rabbis are very passive about it, don't want to get involved, and others are very aggressive and vocal in saying, we need to embrace this progressive cause. So, and it's true also with the Christian clergy, to the extent that I've seen it here. Even the African American clergy, African American Chicago is a complicated place, There are stakeholders in that community, and a business community, a middle class that says, let us not rock the boat. For a few bigots who come to town, we're playing a bigger game here, right, about the things that we often hear discussed today. Economic wealth building, power. And then there is an African American labor union group which says, no way, we need to mobilize, right? We need to do something, we need to be aggressive about it. So in that world too, I think it's fluid, and then it changes as we transition.
On that point, what did the Catholic Archdiocese of Chicago have to say about this priest
Right.
appearing with Gerald L. K. Smith? He described him as a renegade.
Right.
Explain.
Right, so he had a complicated pathway. He was defrocked, and some parts,
When? Before?
he was defrocked before this, but then he kind of moved to the south, and no, he was in the south. He moved up north, and he found some sort of Catholic sponsors who were willing to kind of re-accept him. But yeah, Catholic. It was a, the best way I can understand what this is to say that just like I mentioned, certain parts of the African American community had a vested interest in certain, didn't want to rock the boat in some ways. Catholics in Chicago and Irish Catholics tended to be pretty hostile to all of this civil rights activism and tended to view it with suspicion as either a political threat to them or just a threat for people that they were not particularly inclined to support. So I can tell you that this case, I had the opportunity to interview a guy named Danny Zemmel, who's a prominent American Jewish rabbi, former rabbi. So it turns out that in a longer version of this talk, you hear me talk about Danny Zemmel's father, who was the lawyer who took this case to the Supreme Court. He was he was a Jewish man in Chicago, went to law school, got a job. He was the only Jewish guy in the DA's office. And when there was this pressure to bring this case up from Jews and African Americans, everyone else were Irish Catholics, and they had no interest in prosecuting this case. So they gave it to Zemmel because they figured, I'll give it to the junior guy, he'll fail. Of course, he didn't fail. And then it went to the Supreme Court. Very interesting descriptions of the Catholic sort of political establishment being like, we don't want to deal with this, right? This doesn't look good because who are the cops in Chicago? You know, they're Catholics. We don't want to get into this. We don't want to be, we don't want these bigots here, but we're not going to expend our political capital to help with this. That's not to say there are not obviously Catholics involved in the civil rights movement. It's an important strain, but in this case, it's Chicago, right? For those of you who have been there or read about it, the politics of race, religion, class, ethnicity. It's many, many books have been written about it.
Well, in 5 more minutes, you want to talk about affirmative action.
Oh, yeah.
And how this leads into that.
Yeah, that's a really, very, really important story, and I will just be very honest with you and say, I haven't written that far. I mean, I haven't gone that far in doing the research that I'm sharing with you. But it is very clear that there are these economic forces that really affect Jewish self-perception, and there are people who recognize in affirmative action a claim not just about justice but about identity, right? And there's a new book out by Professor Mark Bollinger, right, which looks at how Jews react to Black power. And he says it really has a huge effect on Jewish identity in America, even though maybe people sometimes criticize it, that Black power is associated with antisemitism and radicalism, that it also affects many American Jews thinking about how they want to be publicly Jewish, what's possible. The funny thing is, it actually almost unleashes some of what we now recognize as a certain political conservatism and a certain very bold Orthodox American Judaism. And it has a strangely catalytic effect on certain parts of the community. And these people react to it with much more, I would just say, it fits the story we know, which is incredible ambivalence, if not outright opposition. That affirmative action is a violation of the trust we built up, and it's a violation of everything that we worked for in that earlier moment of equality, blind justice. And here, now the government is going to do things that it isn't supposed to do, and now it's going to be treating people as groups, and we lose because we just become white and we don't get the advantage. And there's a lot of strong reckoning with that. There's not a lot of looking back and saying, well, wait a second, we talked about group rights and economic needs and political and legal. And I think it's important, for instance, to say that the story of affirmative action, the story of Skokie, there's something there about how American Jews are thinking about law. Right? The story of the 1970s is a powerful intersection of those things. I don't know that I can share more about that, but I think it's an important point in the story.
So I think the invisibility of this argument to public Jewish discourse about it is really fascinating.
Right.
Because it's all right in that story that you're telling today.
Right.
It's really fascinating, and having lived through that period of time as a young faculty member and in other ways, what I certainly remember was a strong response in writing from African American activists toward Jews is, you climbed the ladder and you pulled it up behind you. And you won't make room for us. And no, of course, what you are arguing about left us out. Now that you're up the ladder, it's very compelling.
And can I just add to something along those lines? Because I think if we move forward, some 40 years, right? Because now the discourse is not necessarily about equality, which that's what it was in the 1960s and 70s. It's really about equity. And so when we think about the discourse of equity, which gets back to this idea of thinking about how do you create parity that's not just simply equality, blind equality, right? And so so part of this, there's lots of questions I have. First of all, again, I concur, fascinating discussion. But it also sort of begs the question of a lot of things, including the idea of separate but equal, right? Because certainly in African American communities in the 1950s, and of course Thurgood Marshall Jr. was a part of these things where there were some saying we want to ensure separate and equal versus what ultimately won out, which was separate and equal does not match up with our ideas of American exceptionalism and everyone should be equal. So I do think that there is something about this idea of taking this discourse forward and thinking about how does it now shape our ideas around equity, equality, etc.
Yeah, I know, I absolutely agree. First of all, I would say two things in response to that as I think we finish up. One is that the other name I played with to call these people is egalitarians, because there was a discourse about equity that's there, and it's not just about community and groupness. It's also about sort of what we think about should the is the goal substantive equality, right, or equity versus formal equality. So I think that absolutely is there and carries through. And the other thing I would say is, the book project eventually does go on, and it culminates in Charlottesville in 2017. And one of the interesting things that comes out of that is the paucity of legal responses to that threat and the challenges, and what we see has emerged as the number one go-to response for how people fight bigotry is torts and private action. So the Southern Poverty Law Center is famous for doing this, and which is we sue the pants off them. So now in Charlottesville, there's a lawsuit, and Robbie Kaplan, who's a very prominent lawyer for LGBTQ rights, and argued one of the most famous court arguments about marriage equality. The Supreme Court is now suing neo-Nazis in Charlottesville. And that's an interesting thing, because I don't love this word because I think it hides more than it says, but when we talk about neoliberal approaches and talk about sort of economics and law, the privatization of it is a big dimension of this, and the idea that in fact we could just use torts. We can file lawsuits against the bad guys. So we do it, and the government doesn't have to do it, and so that the we becomes a different type of actor, and then all the questions about economics and the things. It doesn't directly address what you're saying, but I think it tells us something about how this maps onto a larger story about what every historian now talks about, which is the issue of capitalism. And not to knock it, but anyway, thank you all very much.
Thank you.